Should I start? Yeah, okay. Okay. All right. This week's Sedra is Parshas Misphatim. And in the Parshas Misphatim, at the end of the Sedra, the Torah tells us about HaKadosh Baruch Hu telling, the way Rashi explains it, Moshe Rabbeinu to go up to Har Sinai to receive the tablets, the 10 commandments that were engraved on the tablets of stone. And the Torah there says, the Torah says, Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, God said to Moshe, Ale Elai Hahara, ascend to me to the mountain, the Heyesham, and remain there. Ve'etna lecha, and I will give you luchos ha'even, the stone tablets, v'haTorah, the Torah, v'hamitzvah, the commandment, the commandments, asher kasafti, that I wrote, lahorosam, to teach or to direct them. And the Gemara in Brachas, Daf Hey, is somewhat troubled by the redundancy of the words. Why was it necessary to mention all these words? Why would it not have been enough to mention that Moshe Rabbeinu is going up to Har Sinai to get the stone tablets, the Aseres HaDibros, the 10 commandments that were engraved on the tablets? And because of that, the Gemara in Brachas has a drasha. It says, well, luchos ha'even, that's the simple explanation, is the stone tablets of the 10 commandments. We understand that. But what does it mean, HaTorah? So from a drasha perspective, HaTorah comes to tell us that Moshe Rabbeinu, in some form of shape, the Ramban discusses it, others discuss it, how it was given, but to the Torah is mikra. Now, literally, mikra means that part of Torah that one is to read. In other words, there is a difference between the written Torah and the oral Torah. In the written Torah, the words themselves are Torah. So let's say somebody will read a parsha of the Torah. Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'asaretz, the first parsha of the Torah. And he won't understand even one word of the pasuk. But the fact that he verbalized the words of the pasuk, he fulfills to a certain degree the mitzvah of limrat Torah, the mitzvah of learning Torah. Because when it comes to the written Torah, so just the verbalization of the words is at least a partial fulfillment of learning Torah, of saying Torah. However, when it comes to Talmud, when it comes to the Torah Shebaal Peh, when it comes to the oral tradition, even after it was put into writing, so then, if you don't understand anything, you do not fulfill the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. No one understands fully, but you understand what you don't understand, and you work on it. But if a person just reads it and he doesn't come to any understanding of it, he does not fulfill the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Listen, kol hascholos kashos. It's very difficult at the beginning, but little by little a person picks up, and then he gets a reward for the effort that he put in and that he achieved that in what he ultimately learned. But if a person just reads the words without understanding anything, then he does not fulfill a mitzvah of learning Torah if it's learning the oral tradition, because in the oral tradition, it's not the words that are Torah, it's the ideas that are Torah. So Torah, the word Torah, God said to Moshe, I will give you the tablets of stone, the 10 commandments, Torah, and the Torah. So what does Torah come to tell us? That in addition to the 10 commandments, God gave Moshe the Torah itself. And Zem Mikra, that is that which is supposed to be read, that there's a fulfillment in the reading of the words themselves. And Rashi adds Chumash. This is the Chumash, because if somebody reads the words of Chumash, even if he doesn't understand it, he fulfills a certain mitzvah. And then Rashi, then the Gemara continues. Mitzvah. What is mitzvah come? Mitzvah comes to tell us about Mishnah. Now, what is Mishnah? Now, initially, the halacha was, the law was, that one could not use a text to teach Torah that should be used to teach Torah in public, to give over to future generations. The oral and the oral Torah. The written Torah, on the contrary, the mitzvah was that the text should be used when it comes to the written Torah. But when it comes to the oral Torah, so initially the mitzvah was that the oral Torah has to be given over in an oral manner. But ultimately, when it was proven to be that they no longer could give over Torah that way, as the Rambam describes it, the people moved from place to place. The people were not as learned, whatever it was. It became necessary, perhaps, to have like a text. But the text itself that was initially allowed for the teaching of Torah was an abbreviated form. It only hinted to some of the halachas. The text was used as a jumping board, so to say, for the teacher to expound on. But the Talmud, the Gemara, in our day, that represents the discussions that people had in explaining the Mishnah. But the Mishnah was initially written by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi in an abbreviated form. Why? In order to retain this being the oral Torah. In other words, it was very important that the oral Torah should be taught orally. And even when it was necessary for a text, very little was put into the text. The text was only used to initiate a discussion between teacher and students. But later on, ultimately, even that couldn't work. And it became necessary to put down the discussions in a text. All the discussions that were made in discussing the Mishnah. And that was the Talmud, that was the Gemara. So the HaMitzvah, that's the Mishnah. The Mishnah was put together by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was about 100 years before the destruction of the Second Temple. But in some form or shape, and we'll get into it, in some form or shape, the idea of a Mishnah was transmitted to Moshe at Har Sinai. Zu Mishnah, Asher Kasafti. What does Asher Kasafti comes to tell me? That which I wrote, those additional words, that has reference to the Nevi'im and Ksuvim, the prophets and the writings that were included in the Bible, in the Tanakh. Elu Nevi'im Ksuvim lahorosam, to direct them, to teach them. Ze Gemara, some have the Girsas at Talmud. In other words, the teaching, explaining of the Mishnah, that's lahorosam. Now, this was written before the Gemara was put into writing. So it's talking about the oral discussions that they had, the oral learning that was not included in the Mishnah, but very often explained the Mishnah. So the Pasuk comes to tell us that they were all given at Sinai. Now we have to understand, what does that mean, that they were all given at Sinai? Now, so we have really 4 forms, according to this, 4 different parts of Torah. One is Mikra, which Rashi says is Chumash. Then you have Mishnah, which was composed by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, which was an abbreviated form of the oral Torah. And then you have the Asher Kasafti, the Nevi'im Ksuvim, which was later added. The prophets was later added to the Bible, later added to Tanakh. And somehow that was also given to Moshe at Sinai. Lahorosam, to teach them, means that there was an oral tradition that even after the Mishnah was written, there was an oral tradition that could not be put into writing. Ultimately, everything was put into writing because of necessity. Okay, now, so there are 4 forms of Torah that were given over to Moshe: the Chumash, the Mishnah, the Nevi'im and Ksuvim, the prophets, and the Gemara and the Talmud, the discussion, the oral discussions about the Mishnah, and perhaps about other things as well. However, the Rambam, he mentions only 2. The Rambam says in the Hagdama, in his introduction to Yarach HaZokah, he says there were 2 sections of Torah. One is Torah, which he defines as Torah Shebechsav, the written Torah, and included in it is the Chumash, the Nevi'im, and the Ksuvim. So whereas the Gemara separates the Torah, the Chumash, from the Nevi'im and Ksuvim, the Rambam puts them in as one category. And the HaMitzvah, that's Torah Shebaal Peh. That's the oral tradition. Now, the Gemara has 2 separate sections for the oral tradition. There is the Mishnah, and there is the Gemara or Talmud. And the Rambam includes them both in the words v'hamitzvah, which is the word that we deduce the fact that the concept of Mishnah was given over to Moshe Rabbeinu. So the question is, why does the Rambam deviate from the way the Gemara wrote it? That's the question. Now the Torah Shebechsav. Why was it? So originally, as I mentioned, the Torah, the written Torah, had to be taught from a text, and the oral Torah was not allowed to be taught in public and for future generations from a text. It had to be taught orally. But little by little, we were allowed to put the oral Torah into writing, and that's the Mishnah that we have, and that's the Gemara that we have. But why was it allowed? After all, originally it was prohibited. So the Gemara in Gittin says, because Eis Lasos LaHashem Haferet Torasecha. Sometimes the situation, it becomes of such nature that the Chachamim are empowered because they recognize that the learning of Torah will come to an end unless a change is made in the way learning takes place. So because of that, the Chachamim were empowered by the Torah to change the requirements. So first they allowed only the abbreviated form because they wanted to keep the concept of Torah Shebal Peh, of the oral Torah as an oral Torah. But ultimately, they had to allow everything to go into writing. Now, why? Because Eis Lasos Hashem, it was absolutely necessary. But initially, even when it became absolutely necessary to have a text, they only allowed an abbreviated text. And the question arises, how are we allowed to write Sfarim, to write commentaries today? And they say over in the name of the Chassam Sofer, that the Chassam Sofer said that even today, one is only allowed to write a sefer, to write Sfarim, to write commentaries on the oral Torah if it's an Eis Lasos LaHashem, if there is a great need for those Sfarim. But if there is no great need for those Sfarim, then you're not allowed to put the oral Torah into writing. I mean, that would put almost all the Sfarim printers out of business. Obviously, the custom is not in accordance with the Chassam Sofer, because we see that people write books and commentaries on the oral Torah, on the Gemara, which is not necessary. Torah would survive without most of these Sfarim, without most of these commentaries, without most of these books. It could be that they rely on the fact that almost no one will use them anyway. So perhaps that might be their heter, but I don't think that that's something that they would publicize. So the question is, what's our heter? How is it that people day after day are printing one book after another with the Chedushim, with their insights, or the insights that they took from others, and make it public, when the oral tradition can only be put into writing if it's an Eis Lasos LaHashem, if it's absolutely necessary for the continuation and the perpetuation of Torah study. There are Sfarim today. A person could argue, let's say, a sefer like the Mishnah Berurah and the Aruch HaShulchan, if they hadn't been put into writing, it would be difficult for people today to learn the Shulchan Aruch, to learn the laws. The Igros Moshe, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, he writes the contemporary shilas that came up, many of which did not exist in Europe. Shiurim of many of the Rosh Yeshivas, not all, but you could say that it's necessary for the continuation of Torah study. Certainly the Chedushim of the Rishonim, of the early commentators. But what's the leniency for all these books that are printed today for public study? Now, my father in his Sefer mentions that when he was a young boy, so he remembers that Rabbi Chana Wasserman was at my grandfather's house, and a discussion took place. I think my father said he was 6 years old at the time. There was a discussion that took place between Rabbi Chana Wasserman and my grandfather and my uncle. And Rabbi Chana Wasserman said something that is somewhat strange, but he said that when Mashiach comes and the generation will be steeped in Torah learning, so we will not have a need for all these books that we have today. And it will be prohibited to learn the oral tradition from a text, from books, as it was in the days prior to the Mishnah being put into writing. In other words, according to the way I understand what Rabbi Chana Wasserman told my grandfather and my uncle, that my father, this young boy, he overheard it, but he remembered it. He said that there will not be, that the whole reason, he said like the Chassam Sofer, the whole reason that we are allowed to use the text for the oral tradition because Eis Lasos Lashem, because if we didn't allow for the use of texts, Torah study would be forgotten. People would not be able. But after Mashiach comes, the Jewish people will be on such a high level, like prior to the time when the Mishnah was put into writing. So we will not lead all these Sfarim. Consequently, we will not be able to teach with Sfarim. It'll have to be taught. The oral Torah will have to be taught orally, without books, without a text. That's what the Rabbi Chana Wasserman said. And it's interesting, there is a story about the rugged shover. The rugged shover was known to be very, very sharp. And if somebody said something that he didn't like, he let him know that it didn't make sense. And by the way, sometimes it made a lot of sense, but the rugged shover, he had his own way of thinking. So the rugged shover, somebody once bought a book to the rugged shover, and that he was about to print. And he wanted the rugged shover's opinion about the book. And the rugged shover was looking through the book. He says, I finally understand the explanation of the pasuk. And they asked the question. So the guy was so excited that his book inspired the rugged shover to understand something that he didn't understand before. He said, what pasuk? He says, it says, Az Yiranu Kol Yatzei Hayar. All the trees of the fields will sing, dance, have a hofa bringing. So he said, I didn't understand why when Mashiach comes, are the trees going to be so happy? He said, when Mashiach comes, there will be somebody in charge of what Sfarim can be printed and what Sfarim can't be printed. What books can be printed and what books cannot be printed. And a book like yours, they won't let be printed. Now, paper is made from the trees. So the trees will be very happy. In other words, Mashiach's coming will install a certain form of Jewish leadership that will determine which svarim, which books are necessary and which books are not necessary. Your book is not necessary. So we'll be saving a lot of trees. So since we'll be saving a lot of trees, the trees will celebrate, they'll sing and dance. It'll be a real holiday for the trees when Mashiach comes. So the Rogatchover apparently, to a certain degree, agreed with Rabbi Chana Wasserman. He said that when Mashiach comes, you will not be allowed to put into writing. I don't know if he held like Rabbi Chana Wasserman that the Svarim we already have will have to go to Geniza, to Sheamus, but but certainly new Svarim will not be able to be printed because there will be people in charge who will say this sefer, this book cannot be printed because it's Torah Sheba'al Peh and there is no need for this book. So it could be what he said about the pasuk itself was somewhat cynical, but the concept behind it, he was very similar to what Rabbi Chanan Basman. However, my grandfather and my uncle, according to what my father said, disagreed vehemently with Rabbi Chanan Basman, and they said that they said that no, if you take a look at the Rambam in the Hagdama, the Rambam in his introduction to the Yad HaChazaka, to the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam in his introduction, he lists the 40 generations from Moshe Rabbeinu, 40 generations from Moshe Rabbeinu to Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi was the one who put the Gemara into writing, put the Talmud into writing. And Rav Ashi, the Rambam says, was Sof Chachmei HaMasorah. He was the last of the generations of the Masorah, of the giving over of the oral tradition. Matter of fact, my father, the Rambam lists 40 generations. Who were the leaders of each generation, giving over the oral tradition from one generation to the other? So once the Chachmei HaMasorah came to an end, the prohibition of the prohibition against using a text came to an end. In other words, why did there have to be an oral tradition? There had to be an oral tradition in order to give over the Torah from one generation to the other. But once all the books, it became necessary, and there was an allowance given to print all of Torah Sheba'al Peh. The prohibition against having an oral text was removed completely. So then there is no longer the Chachmei HaMasorah came to an end. The Chachmei HaMasorah came to an end, and consequently everything could be printed. Now it's obvious that when you have a 2,000 years, not 2,000 years, but 1800 years separating the last of the Chachmei Masorah, till the coming of Mashiach, b'mehera b'yameinu. So the chain of the Chachmei Masorah was broken. So the Torah Shabbal Peh, and from the Rambam it appears that way also. From the Rambam it appears that the Torah at the end of Hilchos Megillah, although people could read it somewhat differently, that the Torah Shabbal Peh, as such as it is, will continue to exist. Gehilchos Torah Shabbal Peh. So the Gemaras, the Mishnayos, all the Svarim that we had, and even new Svarim, will continue to be printed. Once the Chachmei HaMasorah came to an end, the prohibition was removed completely. And this was the opinion that my grandfather and my uncle had. Now, to understand it, I want to mention something that my uncle writes it in some of his Svarim. When the Rambam discusses about the giving over Torah from generation to generation, so he mentions that Yoshua, Pinchas, and Eliezer, they received Torah from Moshe. He says, but Yehoshua, who was the Talmud, the student of Moshe Rabbeinu, so Moshe tzivohu aleha, Moshe commanded him about the Torah. So the question is, what is the distinction? And more than that, and then he says, and Yehoshua, Pinchas, received the Torah from Yehoshua. So first he says that Pinchas was one of the three who received Torah from Moshe. And then he says that Pinchas received Torah from Yehoshua. Apparently, there was a distinction between the way Moshe Rabbeinu gave over the Torah to Pinchas and Eliezer, and the way he gave it over to Yehoshua. The way he gave it over to Yehoshua, my uncle writes, that's Tzivo Aleha. But my uncle, in other words, my uncle says he commanded him. He had the responsibility of giving over the Torah, whereas they assumed they received the knowledge of the Torah from Moshe, but they did not receive from Moshe the responsibility of giving the Torah over to future generations. So, of the Masorah. What's the idea? Of course, everybody has to give over Torah to future generations. What's the idea? But the idea is that so long as there was an oral tradition that could not be, this is what I think the explanation, at least part of the explanation is, so long as there was an oral tradition that could not be put into writing. So there was one or two people in a generation that had the responsibility of making sure that the Torah will be given over to the next generation. After Moshe Rabbeinu, Yehoshua had that responsibility. After Yehoshua, Pinchas had that responsibility. After Pinchas, Eli had that responsibility. And so it went down for 40 generations. My father, when he was 5 years old, Reb Chaim Ozer, the Rav of Vilna, Reb Chaim Ozer tested my father on all 40 generations. And my grandfather apparently was of the opinion that before one learns Gemara, they should learn the introduction of the Rambam to Yad HaChazaka, to understand how the oral tradition was given over. So my father always had a very good memory, but even at the age of 5, he recited all the 40 generations to Reb Chaim Moshe. Reb Chaim Moshe was very impressed that a child at 5 years old was able to recite all 40 generations by heart. So now the question is, but until that time, the Torah had to be given over orally. It could not be given over with a text. Why was it necessary that the Torah be given over orally? And I mentioned many times in this year, the Beis Halevi. The Beis Halevi says that it mentions a medrash. The medrash says that if the Jewish people had not built a golden calf, if they did not make the Egel Hazav, so there would not have been an oral tradition. And the Beis Halevi asks the question, how is it possible that we should only have the written Torah and not the oral Torah? The written Torah by itself could not be understood with the oral Torah. So the Beis Halevi suggests that it doesn't mean that the laws that we find in the oral Torah would not have been incumbent upon us, but many of the laws of the oral Torah would have been in the written Torah as well. It would have been written explicitly in the written Torah. But because the Jewish people built the golden calf, so many things that would have been included in the written Torah was given over only as part of the oral tradition. Now the question is, what is the connection between the golden calf, between the building of the Egel Hazav and the taking laws and rules that would have been included in the written Torah and giving them over only as part of the oral Torah? What is the connection? But what do we see from the Egel Hazav? And this is a point I've mentioned. Moshe Rabbeinu goes away for 40 days. And the Jewish people are bowing down. The Jewish people who 40 days beforehand said, Nasa b'nishma. The Jewish people who 40 days beforehand were on a level, according to our sages, higher than malachim, higher than angels, stand in front of a golden calf and say, Elu Elohecha Yisrael, this is your God, O Israel. How are we to understand the transformation that takes place over such a short period of time? But the answer is there was a change of milieu. There was a change in the situation. When they said Nasa v'nishma, they were together with Moshe Rabbeinu. I think the Balatanya, the Balatanya and the Malbim both say, because in Chumash Dvarim it says, Ma Hashem Lakecha Dorish Meimcha. What does God ask of him? To Yeros, or to fear him, L'avos, or to love him, and so on and so forth. So the Medrash says, "V'chi milsos atrayi." Is that a small thing? Avas Hashem, love of God. Yiras Hashem, fear of God. How could Moshe Rabbeinu say Ma Hashem Elokecha dorish mincha. What is God asking for you? So the Gemara says, Ein gabe Moshe, by Moshe, it's a small thing. So they asked the question, was the Torah written only for Moshe? What do you mean, Ein gabe Moshe? It was written for Klal Yisrael. So the Malbim and the Baal Tanya say, gabe Moshe, it means when you're in close proximity to Moshe. When Moshe is there, for the Jewish people, it's a simple thing. Not that they always did it, but it was easier when you were with Moshe. When Moshe Rabbeinu disappeared for 40 days, so they could stand this. There was a change in the situation. When there was a change in the situation, they could stand in front of a golden calf and say, Elu Elohecha Yisrael. I mean, I heard many people, historians, talk how when the communists, with their anti-religious activity, took over the towns of Russia, the Jewish towns, overnight, people who up to that point were observant and seemingly God-fearing, overnight, they gave up religious observance completely. There was a change in the situation. But here we're talking about a different type of change in situation, where your Rebbe, Moshe Rabbeinu, he was the Rebbe, he was the teacher of the Jewish people. And he was away for 40 days. And the same question could be asked about the Meraglim, the spies who went out to the land of Israel. Roshei B'nai Yisrael Haima, when they left the Jewish people to go on their mission, they were leaders of the Jewish people. Rashi says, Anoshim Ksherim. And then they come back and lead a rebellion against Moshe and against God. How are we to understand it? But for 40 days, they were away from Moshe. These leaders of the Jewish people. There are many things that we tolerate today. And perhaps because we think that our institutions will benefit financially. But if we had the leaders of old, and when I say the leaders of old, I'm not going back too far, these things would never have been tolerated. Because the leaders of old knew that while receiving financial support for our institutions is important, but dedication to Torah lifestyles and opposition to lifestyles that negate the Torah is a very serious matter. It would have been a different situation. But the leaders of old, the leaders who had Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem, these were traits that were identified mainly with many of the European Jews. American Jews do not have those traits in the same manner. So we can be religious, but we tolerate all kinds of abominations, all to get the bribery of society and of the government. So because of that, it was important that we have a situation that people will be forced to have a Rebbe. They will be forced to learn from somebody. And because of that, it was important that there be an oral tradition. A written tradition does not necessitate a Rebbe. But an oral tradition, if you want to identify with Torah, if you want to identify with learning Torah, then you need a Rebbe, then you need a teacher. And that's what we learned from the golden calf. We saw the result of not being together with Moshe, their teacher. So because of that, it was necessary to have an oral tradition. Now, so the determination, but sometimes we reach a situation that although it's important to have a Rebbe, sometimes the steps that we use to necessitate the having of a Rebbe could be proved to be counterproductive. Once the Jewish people spread over the face of the earth, and you won't always have access to a Rebbe, certainly a proper Rebbe. So the text had to be written. First, it was written in an abbreviated form, and then it was written in a more complete form. And in a complete form, the prohibition against writing the oral tradition down was removed completely. And that's why today we could write Sfarim. The necessity of having the Chachmei Nesorah, the leaders of each generation who were in charge of determining, is it necessary today, to what degree is it necessary to keep the Torah in an oral form? The need for that came to an end when all of the oral Torah was put into writing. So now the Nevi'im Ksuvim, Reb Chaim said, my great-grandfather, he said, what was the status of the Nevi'im Ksuvim? When they, according to the Gemara, they were given over at Matan Torah at Har Sinai. Could be when it says Moshe me Har Sinai, it doesn't literally mean at Mount Sinai. It means Moshe Rabbeinu. So whether the words themselves were given over to Moshe Rabbeinu, or the concept of Nevi'im Ksuvim were given over to Moshe Rabbeinu, I think there's another way we can understand it. When we say the Nevi'im Ksuvim were given over to Moshe Rabbeinu, so the Nevi'im Ksuvim were given over to Moshe Rabbeinu. In other words, we find sometimes drashos between words that are in the Nevi'im Ksuvim and in the Torah. It's true. We say Divrei Torah midivrei Kabbalah lo yalfinan. You cannot learn halachas of the Torah from the Nevi'im Ksuvim, from the prophets. But there are rayos. Not everybody says this, but I think it's pretty clear from the Gemara and Megillah. But the reverse is true. In other words, sometimes when you find a certain word in the Torah and a certain word in the Nevi'im Ksuvim, the Torah reveals to us how we are to understand the Nevi'im Ksuvim. And even vice versa, there are certain things that we can learn out from similarities about the Torah, from similarities in the Nevi'im Ksuvim and the prophets. So, in other words, when the Torah was given, it was given with the Nevi'im and Ksuvim in mind, what the future Nevi'im and Ksuvim would be said. So, to a large degree, not only the concept of Nevi'im and Ksuvim were given over to Moshe Rabbeinu, but the Nevi'im and Ksuvim played a role. What the Nevi'im and Ksuvim will say in the future played a role in the determination in how the Torah was to be written. Now, So I think we can answer our question against the Rambam. We asked the question, the Rambam creates only two categories, and the Gemara says there are four categories. I think historically, in other words, at Mount Sinai, Moshe Rabbeinu was told that throughout the history of the Jewish people, throughout the history of Torah learning, throughout its history, there will be four categories of Torah. Initially, the only Torah that will be written will be the Chumash, initially. So that's Torah. HaMitzvah, that's Mishnah. Why is that called? Because the determination of what can be written was dependent upon the person who succeeded Moshe in each generation. The successor to Moshe Rabbeinu was Yoshua. The successor to Yoshua was Pinchas until Ravashi, 40 generations after Moshe Rabbeinu. And the expression of the Torah in Parshas Pinchas, when Moshe Rabbeinu is told to appoint Yoshua as his successor in being responsible, Tzivohu Aleha, to command him concerning the Torah, not just to command him about what's in the Torah, but to command him about the Torah, as the Rambam phrases it, the giving over the Torah, how the Torah is to be given over, in whether it could be written or it has to be in oral form, to determine on the needs of the generation. So Moshe was told to command Yoshua in front of the Bnei Yisrael. Tzab. And the Medrash tells us, the Sifri says, Tzivo al divrei Torah. He commanded him concerning the divrei Torah when he appointed Yoshua as his successor. And each generation afterwards, the leader of that generation accepted the Torah from the leader of the previous generation, and he had the responsibility. But when it came to the time of Ravashi, that prohibition was removed completely because it was necessary for the continuation and the perpetuation of Torah. But it was only because, so, and Tanakh, initially, it was given over to Moshe Rabbeinu in the sense of how the Torah should be written. The Torah, of course, the Torah was dictated by God, but it was dictated to Moshe Rabbeinu in a manner that it should be used to explain later on the Nevi'im Uksuvim. So in a certain sense, and the concept that there will be added to the Tanakh, added to the Bible, Nevi'im Uksuvim, that was given over to Moshe Rabbeinu also. But when did it actually become Torah Shebechsav? That's only when the Navi, when Yehoshua and Shmuel and Yirmiyah, when they wrote the prophets, that's when it became Torah Shebechsav. That's when it became part of the written tradition. But before that point, it was part of the oral tradition, but it was different than the other oral tradition. The other oral traditions did not impact the way the Torah Shebechsav should be written to make drushos, but this had an impact on the way. So it was, to a certain degree, it was given over in a different way than the oral tradition was given over. And then ultimately, but even after the Mishnah was written in an abbreviated form, they had to keep the Torah Sheba'al Peh as long as they could as an oral tradition, and that was the Gemara. Matter of fact, the Gemara in Brachas says there's an opinion that Birchas HaTorah, the bracha that we recite in the morning before learning, did not have, we don't paskin that way, did not have to be recited on Gemara. It had to be recited on the Mishnah. Now, this obviously was said before the Gemara was put into writing. So in other words, they felt that only things that could be made a text required a bracha. But once the Gemara was put into writing, so there was no question about it anymore, according to that opinion. But that opinion was said before the Gemara was put into writing. So, but today we only have two categories. We have Torah Shabbat and Torah Shabbal Peh. And the Torah Shabbal Peh today, that all of Torah Shabbal Peh today, that the whole oral tradition can be put into writing as a text. So it's all like the Mishnah. So therefore today, Torah is Torah Shabbat. It's the written Torah. The written Torah is Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim. It's the Torah and the prophets. And the Mishnah, the oral tradition that could be in writing, is the whole Torah Shabbal Peh. Anything could be written, any book could be written to be taught in public. But all that was only because of the necessity. Ideally, the Torah Shabbal Peh had to be oral. Why? It had to be oral to emphasize the importance of having a Rebbe, to necessitate the having of a Rebbe. Today, Torah is spread in many different ways through the internet and all that. And even though you hear the voice or a mechanical version of the voice of the Rebbe, it's not a Rebbe unless you learn together with him. So this is because when it comes to learning from a Rebbe, you don't just learn from the words that he says, you learn from whom he is. And at the end of this week's Sedra, Yehoshua accompanies Moshe onto Har Sinai and up to a certain point. And then Yehoshua waits there. And Rashi says, what's the purpose of Yehoshua here? And I think the answer is very simple, because when it comes to Torah, Torah is not just the words. It's not just the teaching. It's who the person is, Moshe Rabbeinu's expressions, his feelings and his emotions. That was also Torah. And Yehoshua is the one who had to give over to future generations of Torah. So Yehoshua had to accompany Moshe as far as he could in order to give over to future generations, not just what Moshe said, but the expressions and the feelings of Moshe Rabbeinu as he climbs up Har Sinai in order to receive the Luchos, in order to receive the Torah. And that's the lesson that we have to learn. Yes, Torah Shabbal Peh is written, but we need a Rebbe. We need a Rebbe to teach us the text. But even more important than that, we need a Rebbe to learn from who the Rebbe is. Okay. I don't think I hear you. I don't know if everybody else hears you. Hmm.